Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Pimentel and what promises to be a very illuminating evening. I'm sorry for the slight delay, but we're working out some technical problems. My name is Michael Pollan. I'm a professor at the Graduate School of Journalism and director of the Knight Program in Science and Environmental Journalism, which is the sponsor of this event. It's the fourth in a series we've had this semester, and the climactic one on the impact of technologies, new technologies on society and human life. I have to start with a little unfortunate news, which is we've lost one of our panelists. Richard Rhodes called this afternoon to say that because of a medical emergency in his family that's taking him out of town, he's not going to be able to be with us. So I'm very sorry about that. And before I go any further, I just want to thank a couple people who helped organize this event. Chad Heater, Marcia Parker, Lenita Pace-Hinton at the Journalism School for lots of help in pulling this together, and their great good humor in the face of my very shallow learning curve on throwing events. And also to Dennis Devine, Nate Johnson, and Jeff Noctegal for helping out. Tonight's event is actually the continuation of a conversation, of a movable conversation on technological change that a shifting group of thinkers, inventors, and writers has been conducting for a few years now. First at a series of retreats, then a conference at Columbia University, and then in the pages of a wonderful book, which I should have to hold up, Living with the Genie. And it's when I actually read this book that I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to bring this conversation or some part of it to Berkeley? Its premise is that we stand on the threshold of profound technological changes, not simply to our way of life, but truly to what it means to be alive and to be human. As the editors of Living with the Genie write in the introduction, capabilities in information processing, genetic manipulation, and molecular synthesis are breaking down the barriers between human and machine intelligence, between artificial and biological processes, and the resulting transformations to society and perhaps humanity itself may dwarf anything we have experienced before. Now, most people's reactions to such statements usually fall into one of two camps, I think. The first, and I confess this was mine, is, well, that's never going to happen. Nanobots are never going to take up residence in my brain, allowing me to think like Einstein or have whole-body virtual reality experiences. Don't be ridiculous. The other response, equally common, I think, is that, sure, it's all inevitable. It's just a matter of time and the market. If people can genetically reprogram their babies, who's going to stop them? The markets won't be denied. And different as these two responses are, they share a crucial common denominator, which is there's nothing to be done. There's nothing that needs to be done. There's nothing for the public. There's no need for the public right now to act or even think about the future in its future. We stand passive before these changes, waiting on the beach for a wave that may or may not come. Yet the course of technological change is not natural, but is in fact determined by human decisions. The question is which humans, and for whose benefit, and who decides. The tradition in this country has been to treat new technologies more or less as entrants in the free marketplace of ideas, there to rise or fall and prove their value. We're also inclined to accord technology the same freedom we have traditionally accorded to science, as if science and technology were the same thing. The question is this approach adequate, and is it wise? If the impact of these technologies is potentially so profound, can we afford to let the marketplace decide our future as a species? If not, then how might the public gain a say in what technologies get developed and what ones don't? So the whole issue of governance becomes critical. All too often the conversation about technological change, especially lately, comes down to what is becoming a fairly ossified debate between the so-called techno-utopians, profiled in the business pages or Wired magazine, and the neo-Luddites, sounding the environmental and ethical alarms. As these labels suggest, mutual respect between these two camps is hard to come by. Our hope tonight is to advance the conversation a few steps beyond that too blunt dichotomy, take the dialectic someplace new, and mix some hope with the skepticism and perhaps some skepticism with the hope. I think you'll see that whatever you may have thought coming in, our panelists all confound such simplistic categories. So let me introduce them so we can get started. It's perhaps fitting that Ray Kurzweil's presence here this evening is more digital than corporeal. For many years now, he's been one of our most far-seeing thinkers and successful inventors in the realm of artificial intelligence. He's the founder of Kurzweil Technologies, the author of The Age of Intelligent Machines, which was voted the most outstanding computer science book in 1990 by the Association of American Publishers. His most recent book is Are We Spiritual Machines? Ray Kurzweil versus the Critics of Strong AI. Howard Rheingold, to my immediate right, is a crucial voice on the social impact of new technologies, and especially information technologies. He foresaw the impact of the internet long before many Americans had heard that word. One of the creators of Hotwired and a former editor of the Whole Earth Review, Howard is the author of several books including The Virtual Community and most recently Smart Mobs, The Next Social Revolution. By the way, these books are available outside if you're interested. Going across the other way there, Mark Schapiro is an award-winning journalist working in both print and television and concentrating on environmental and international affairs. His work has appeared in Harper's, The Nation, and The Atlantic Monthly, as well as on television on Bill Moyer's Now and Frontline World. He's reported extensively on genetically modified crops, both in the U.S. and abroad. He is currently Deputy Editorial Director of the Center for Investigative Reporting in San Francisco. Denise Caruso has been thinking and writing about technological change for the last 20 years at least. Many of you will remember, and sorely miss, at least I do, her groundbreaking technology column every Monday in the New York Times. She gave that up to practice what she preaches by founding the Hybrid Vigor Institute, a think tank dedicated to advancing new ways of approaching problems in health and the environment. And she's currently writing a book about risk. And now let me introduce our moderator tonight and the organizer of this panel, Chris Desser. Chris is the co-editor of Living with the Genie, is an environmentalist, lawyer, and writer in San Francisco. She's the director of the Funders Working Group on Emerging Technologies. She's also served on the California Coastal Commission. And if her interests in coasts and emerging technologies seem contradictory, you might want to check out her wonderful essay on virtuality and nature in Living with the Genie. So I'm going to pass this over to Chris right now. And will you please welcome our panel?
I thought he was actually going to pass that to me. I forgot I had my own little nano mic here. And needless to say, we are faced with advances in science and technology for good and for questionable and for maybe not so good every day. And just in today's New York Times, you all probably saw this. I mean, two stories on the same page. This was A23, which go very directly to the issues that we're going to be talking about. One of them is about support for stem cell research, a letter signed by 206 members of the House asking President Bush to expand his August 2001 executive order limiting federal money for embryonic stem cell research. And we'll probably get into that a little bit today, but a very fascinating instance of how governance can work to direct knowledge in one direction or another. And a second story, actually I'm surprised that they're buried on A23. I think this is really phenomenal. A glimpse at the future of DNA, MDs inside the body. Perhaps you saw this, which is a story about, well, what would basically be little nanobots, computers that can float, that fit in a drop of water, hundreds of these little computers, and can analyze the health or pathology of a cell and deliver medicine. Right now, all it does is it's either on or off, and I think that's a very simplistic way to determine actually whether there's prostate cancer. But the Israeli doctor who discovered it sees a very bright future. I mean, every day in each section of the paper, we see amazing, previously to me unbelievable things happening. And the opportunities afforded and dilemmas caused by science and technology have always been a part of human experience. But these kinds of advances in medicine, in information technology, in biotechnology, in nanotechnology, each of which has the capacity to rapidly and radically transform our lives, begin to strain or at least challenge, our ability to respond in ways that can protect and strengthen democratic society. Some of the issues raised by rapid scientific and technological development are multifaceted. Different areas of science and technology now advance synergistically, multiplying the rate and magnitude of both technological change and social transformation. The distribution of the benefits and costs of scientific and technological advance is highly uneven, both within nations and between them. Access to advanced technologies proliferates, and the production of novel, transforming technologies is becoming routine. The culture of discovery and innovation is changing as private funding displaces public research investments, patent protection expands to emerging types of research findings, and ownership of knowledge becomes a critical issue in the global marketplace. Public policy systems for safeguarding the collective public interest are unable to keep pace with the changes created by emerging knowledge and innovation. In all, the interface between science, technology, and society is evolving at a breakneck pace, but with little understanding of how to interpret and integrate these changes. From the furor over genetically modified organisms to the prohibitive cost of life-saving drugs, to the erosion of personal privacy in an ever more connected world, the need for open discourse and creative thinking is urgent. So that's what we're here to do tonight. And I welcome you and all of our speakers, Ray Kurzweil, Howard Rheingold, Mark Schapiro, and Denise Caruso, to this conversation. And to begin, I'm going to ask each of our speakers here to briefly tell us which technologies you think will have the most significant social impacts over the next 10 years, or conversely, which social trends will have the greatest impacts on technology. And Ray, can you see that I'm turning to face you? I'm going to ask you to begin.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Sorry to hover over the rest of you from behind. This is kind of a crude form of virtual reality. We actually have a three-dimensional version of this where I can appear in 3 dimensions, which I use routinely. We didn't have the opportunity to set that up this evening. But there I appear life-size, and people actually think I'm at these conferences in 3 dimensions. Let me make a few points about technology. I've actually spent the last 25 years modeling technology trends, which I did because of my interest in being an inventor. And I have a team now of 10 people that gather key measures of technology, and I work with mathematicians to model these technology trends so that we can actually anticipate where technology will be and actually invent, that is to say, come up with scenarios for technology of 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and so on. I'd say the most profound insight from this examination is that the rate of progress itself is accelerating. It's doubling every decade. And that's something that people don't realize. And it has very profound implications. The actual power, price, performance, capacity, bandwidth of information technologies actually doubles more quickly than that, doubles every year. And this goes substantially beyond Moore's Law, which now everybody has heard about. Computation itself, for computation, Moore's Law was not the first, but the 5th paradigm for providing exponential growth computing. And when that paradigm runs out of steam, which will happen in about 15 years, we'll go on to the 6th paradigm, which will be 3-dimensional molecular computing, which Chrissy already mentioned. And exponential growth of information technologies goes substantially beyond computing itself. Lots of different technologies. Magnetic storage is a different type of technology. Communication, which we've had a profound revolution in, which is ongoing. Both wired and wireless doubles in price performance every year. Biological technologies are doubling in power every year. We sequence SARS in just a couple of weeks. It took us 3 years to sequence HIV. And we're undergoing now a profound revolution, which we're in the early stages of, biotechnology, comprised of the intersection of information technology and biology. And we're really going to be able to reprogram the metabolic pathways of life. Prototypes of designer babies, which we mentioned, you're going to have designer baby boomers, where we will really be able to change our genes. We already have RNA interference, where we have a technology that can actually turn off gene expression, which would be very powerful in controlling disease. The price performance, bandwidth, resolution, spatial and temporal brain scanning is doubling every year, and our knowledge of the human brain is doubling every year. Human knowledge in general is doubling every year. And the results of all of this will be radical extensions to human life expectancy. By the end of this decade, computers will be so small we won't see them. We will have full immersion, virtual reality, at least visual and auditory, where we can visit with each other and really feel like we're together. If we go out to 2029, this will actually go inside the body. We'll have virtual reality from within the nervous system. It will be very routine to have nanobots. They'll be very non-invasive. People will use them because they'll keep you healthy. They'll destroy pathogens, destroy cancer cells. They'll provide virtual reality from within the nervous system. People will be in the whole flow of sensory experiences and the neurological correlates of their emotions out on the internet, the way people now beam their images from their webcams, and you can plug in and experience what it's like to be someone else. Most importantly, we'll be able to profoundly expand human knowledge and experience and intelligence through intimate merger with our technology. And to get to the point of really this whole dialogue, which as I say has been going on now for a couple of years, there's profound promise and peril in all of this. And the immediate promise, peril, is biotechnology. We're very close to being able to overcome cancer, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, extend human longevity on the one hand, but we're also empowering would-be bioterrorists. The means exist today in the Virginia College Biotechnology Laboratory to create and design a virus that could be both deadly and spread very easily. And then when we get to nanotechnology, we'll have the dangers of self-replicated nanotechnology. When we have strong artificial intelligence, there's no assurance that it will remain friendly to us, although I think the primary implication will be that we're going to merge with it. But there's going to be plenty of promise and peril. Exactly how to manage that, I think, will be the basis of our discussion tonight.
Thank you, Ray. Howard.
Well, I've been working a little bit closer in to where we're sitting today than the world Ray is talking about, which is not that far away, perhaps. I've been engaging people for the last couple of years in talking about where the devices most of us carry in our pockets are going. If you look at the mobile telephones that we carry and you think about our experiences with the PCs over the last 20 years and the internet over the last 10 years, and you apply some of those technological growth curves that Ray is talking about and look at the social changes that have begun to happen, I think we have an opportunity to talk about not just where these technologies may be influencing our society, but to what degree and how might we have influence on the way that technology regime is emerging. I've been talking specifically about the fact that this technology convergence is enabling collective action, enabling people to organize in groups to do things, small groups and large groups, politically, economically, and socially. We're just beginning to see some of those first steps, but I think I don't have to argue that some of those first steps in the political sphere, where there's a president who is no longer the president of the Philippines, there's a president who is now the president of Korea, and another one in Spain, whose elections were largely tipped at the last minute by people deploying the technologies I'm talking about to organize, get out the vote in ways that they weren't before, or to organize mass demonstrations from the grassroots instead of using the broadcast media. I think also, if you look just at the technical capabilities of what we can do collectively with the technologies we carry, you look at the existence of the web itself being the result not of a government or a corporation architecting it from a blueprint, but of millions of people creating web pages and pointing to each other, or of Google using the aggregated decisions of millions of people every day to try to provide a picture of what's worthwhile out in that undifferentiated mass of the net, or collective computing efforts like Napster in regard to 70 million people putting their computers together to make one big music jukebox, or SETI at home, enabling 2 million people to volunteer their PCs when they're not using them to amass something like 20 trillion operations per second of computing power. Put all these things together and you think about what's going to happen 10 years from now when we'll have billions of people carrying or wearing technologies that will be significantly more powerful than our laptop computers today, linked at speeds significantly greater than what we consider broadband today, doing things together, organizing socially and technologically. That provides, I think, a framework for thinking about what will be seen as extraordinary change a long time from now, but also enables us to focus on what we can do about it right now, which is to preserve the right for individuals to influence and shape those future technologies the way we did with the PC and the internet, in the face of a lot of forces that are trying to make us into passive consumers with only the choice of which channel to watch or which brand to buy, digital rights management, extension of the copyright law, the regulation of the wireless spectrum according to the technologies of the 1920s. These are all really parts of a conflict that some techies and some policy wonks know about, but all of us really need to get involved in.
Thank you. Mark.
I do think in terms of profundity of change that is coming, is that we are in the midst of and that will alter our being most profoundly, and I'm not really in the prediction business, but the manipulation of genetic material, which of course is already happening at a very rapid pace and promises to happen to more and more sophisticated levels, altering the very genetic makeup of plants, of animals, and ultimately, of course, potentially of human beings. And I think this is particularly interesting, one, in its profound philosophical basis, which is perhaps an entire other discussion, and independent of whether or not you think this is good, because many arguments can be had as to what is positive and what's not. There are many different facets to it, to the alteration of genetic material. But I think in terms of society, I think the interesting question is the interaction of technological innovation with the existing structures of society and government. And when you start talking about manipulation of genetic material, you are beginning to challenge some of the existing structures that we have become accustomed to, both in the legal sphere, very, very powerfully in the legal sphere, also, of course, in the political sphere, in raising questions about governance and issues like that, and also in assessing the criteria of how we decide what is a success. How do we decide what a success is, or what is beneficial and what is not beneficial? And I think that in terms of the profundity of change, I do think which is perhaps not an original thought, the manipulation of genetic material, both on its own, which many of us have thought about, of course, the philosophical, ethical implications, but more directly is the changes that is forcing in our own concept of governance and legal mechanisms, which in many ways are being outpaced by the technological innovation itself. So I think we can get into that a little later as to what the specifics might be, but I think it's genetic manipulation and the social and legal and political changes that is being impelled by those developments.
Which is exactly what I'm writing my book about.
Yes.
Well, I took a little bit of liberty with the idea of technology, and I'm going to propose that we think of methods as technologies, in particular the way government regulates new technologies. My feeling is that may have to change pretty dramatically in response to social pressure about consequences or potential consequences. You didn't even say, did you want to say who I was? I just launched
This
right
is
in.
Denise Caruso.
Sorry, just realized I launched right in on that, sorry. I think that the government will have to change at some point in response to social pressure about consequences or the potential consequences of these new technologies, especially given the rate of change that Ray is talking about. We're increasing the complexity of our environment exponentially all the time, and that's not actually being addressed by government. And so that's one of the things that I think Mark's referring to as well. And I think that social pressure is probably going to come from us learning more about how companies do business with the government. So, for example, I don't know how long ago was it, Michael? 2 months, that panel with Ignacio and?
Yeah, it was December.
Okay, December. I don't know how many of you were here, but John Losey, a researcher from Cornell, was piped in much the way that Ray is tonight. And he was the guy who published the paper about BT pollen killing monarch butterflies. And I've spoken to him a few times since that panel, and he says that the EPA actually, the Environmental Protection Agency, actually approved this product for use in open fields without requesting any information from Monsanto on non-target insects, which I thought was kind of outrageously irresponsible given the situation. And there's another example is there's a much more heated public debate in the United Kingdom about genetically modified food than there is here. And there was the government funded to the tune of £500 million, 500,000 pounds, £500,000, a debate called GM Nation. And they spent 2 months educating the public about GM food. They did it in public settings, like big public settings like this. They also had these drill down, sort of more like focus group things where they did really individual education of individual people about, the science of genetically modified food, thinking that, of course, this was going to turn the tide. And people would line up behind this and say, yes, we were wrong about GM food. And the truth was that the public ended up wanting, the survey showed that the public ended up wanting more safeguards than before. And they had good reasons for it. It wasn't just hysterical Luddism. They were very distrustful of the government and very distrustful of companies. Of course, while I was in the UK at an event that was talking about GM Nation, documents were leaked to The Guardian that the government had already gone ahead and approved them. They had approved the open farm crop tests, and it didn't really matter what the public thought. I think that they've backed off on it now, but it doesn't bode well for public participation in these things. Part of the problem here is that not very many biotech companies are hits, but they raise a lot of money purely on promises. And this puts an enormous amount of pressure on them to get something in the market that does make money. The government, as a result, is a lot less careful than it could be about these innovations because its role as public protector often gets pushed aside in order to stimulate the economy. I mean, you don't have to look much further than the whole BSE thing and how many people at the USDA at this point came directly from the cattle industry to see how that game works. I see it most in biotech right now because I'm focused on that in my work on risk and GMOs. But outside the U.S., the pushback and the distrust of government and industry is a lot more noticeable than it is here. The market is a lot less powerful outside of the United States, and so you hear a lot more debate, a lot more even-handed debate. And I think this may speak somewhat to some of the things Howard may talk to about later about the media. And these are the things that are going to have to change, I think, if innovation is going to maintain its credibility with the public. I think innovation at any cost at this point in time, at this rate of change, doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think we're going to need to be looking for risk assessment technologies that are at the very least more transparent than they are now, so that we never again have to find out that the EPA didn't ask about non-target insects. And hopefully will also accommodate more input from interested and affected parties. These technologies actually exist. These risk assessment technologies exist. They're not even all that new, but they haven't caught on for a couple of reasons. First, they put innovation in a social and a scientific context, which is a lot more difficult to manage than just getting a probability estimate on some little thing and submitting it to some agency. It's easier to whip up statistics, even if they're derived from faulty assumptions, than it is to sit down and deal with the ambiguity and the complexity that exists in the world today. And the second is that industry and government like things the way they are. They can game the system to their heart's content the way it stands right now, and that seems to be working pretty well for them. I just have one, I know I'm out of time, but I just want to, I want to sort of raise a question about the title of this session, which is about technology and human mastery. I just sort of woke up this morning thinking about, what is it are we trying to master, and who is we? If I truly thought that the answer was, we are trying to master human suffering or suffering in general, I would probably feel more okay about it. But it seems like what we're trying to master is all the living things on the planet, including life. And sometimes that's in the name of alleviating suffering, but not always. And in fact, sometimes by the way, we're going to alleviate suffering with this. Sort of the solution in search of a problem issue. And I'd feel okay about it if we were trying to master fear or master fear of death. But if we're actually trying to master life or death, I kind of don't get the point. It seems like we may be asking the wrong, not we, but this quest for mastery might be asking the wrong question, and I think we might end up getting a very wrong answer. So I'm going to represent Dick Rhodes for a second here, who was going to talk about the technology. He was going to take the same liberty that I was with the term technology, and he was going to talk about the technology of the public health system and how that needs to change, and how now that we've basically conquered infectious disease, we're left with the chronic ones, some of them that Ray was talking about, heart disease and diabetes. And Dick has found research that shows that most of these diseases are caused by adverse childhood experiences. I haven't seen the research, but it sounds pretty interesting to me. So how does the public health system evolve to cope with that? How do we master that with a drug or some pill or something? And I think I think that those more basic questions about context and how we see technology evolving in the larger context of humanity are also really important questions.
So I hope that we can kind of evolve this conversation into something that flows more freely, that is not just sort of me asking questions, but I hope that we will all speak with each other, ask each other questions. But I think that one of the threads that I'm hearing running through what everybody has said is the question of what role do our institutions' attitudes and actions play in mediating and modulating change. So I'm curious, I want to ask you, in each of your fields, how have the governing mechanisms that are in place, if they are in place, been made obsolete by technological innovation? Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Was it time for those governing structures perhaps to fall by the wayside? And then ask as a corollary, should the market determine everything? It possesses limited feedback mechanisms. It does not respond with alacrity to social and ecological signals. On the other hand, in an age of genetic manipulation, our regulatory mechanisms, as Mark was saying, like the FDA and the EPA, are based on obsolete chemical paradigms. So how are we to move forward, given the circumstances that we find ourselves in?
I'm interested in Ray's comments about that, because technology, computing technology in particular, seemed to fly under the radar of regulation for a really long time, and that doesn't seem to be the case with biological stuff.
Well, maybe I can make a few comments. I do think the FDA regulations need to be re-examined. I certainly do think there's a role for very strong regulation, and I agree with the comment. processes we have in the FDA were set decades ago, and they don't balance the risk of delay versus the risk of approving certain therapies. I mean, I'm aware of certain therapies that can help a lot of people in cancer, and have been personally very deeply frustrated that you cannot get access to them because they haven't been approved, because they're not considered safe enough yet. And there's no consideration given to the fact that having cancer is not safe, having terminal cancer is not safe. The cost of delaying gene therapy or various other technologies for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, at hundreds of thousands of lives per year for disease, does not carry that much political weight. One kid died from gene therapy trials in their congressional investigations, and all the research is canceled for an extended period of time. There was no consideration given to the very strong argument that hundreds of thousands of people may die through delay of these very needed therapies. So I think we need to really balance risks more intelligently and realize that life is not free of risks, and consider the suffering that does exist in the world, and that really is the moral imperative that drives the economic imperative of this progress.
Mark, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I just want to address, sir. No, I think it's not really in terms of arguing for or against or banning one particular technology or another. I'm not sure is the issue, or at least for me right now. It's more the kind of questions that are asked and the criteria with which one determines if a technology is a success, meaning who is the ultimate beneficiary and who loses. And it's independent of have some familiar with the genetic engineering question, and far less with computer and even medical technology. But the issue at stake there is how do we determine whether this is a technology that is a quote success and something worth pursuing? Are we asking the right questions? What are the feedback mechanisms that we consider in making those decisions? We, of course, take in the economic questions, a very powerful economic industry. Are we looking at the long-term consequences of the environment, the long-term social consequences? Now, if we were to do this analysis, we could actually very well decide that it's worth all the risks. We could actually totally decide this, and it's a completely plausible argument. But I don't think those kind of questions are applied on a routine or systemic basis. And I think that also, well, I just want to response to Chris's question, is the question of does it make governing mechanisms obsolete? To some extent, I'm not sure it makes them, I'm not even sure obsolete is the right word. Sometimes it demands something entirely new. And I suppose obsolete is the word, but I mean, it requires an entirely new way of thinking about a particular technology and its implications.
I do think there are some grave problems with a lot of the regulations, at least that I'm familiar with. A lot of them are extremely arbitrary. In some cases, we're not considering environmental impact, and we should be really assessing more than we are impact on complex ecological systems. On the other hand, there are very arbitrary rules that the FDA uses. For example, it is almost impossible to test multiple therapies at the same time, cocktail approaches. And it's quite clear, and we don't have time to get into it, but that the only thing that's going to work in cancer, and for most viral diseases, are cocktail approaches, because a virus or cancer will use evolution to evolve around a single attack. So you have to attack it 3 different ways, and that will work. And we saw that in AIDS. The only reason that those AIDS cocktails were approved is not because the FDA was intelligent enough to allow these cocktail approaches, because the AIDS activists were very aggressive in organizing and demanding, in very, very assertive terms, that they absolutely must have these. They learned the science, they knew what was needed, and they got it through. And other groups of patients do not have the same attitude. When cancer patients organize, it's to raise money for breast cancer research. There's nothing wrong with that. But they don't really learn the science and try to organize to, for example, get cocktail approaches for cancer, which would solve the problem. And I've talked to a lot of cancer researchers saying, this drug you're dealing with is very good, but it really would work much better if you combined it with this anti-angiogenesis drug. And I said, yes, that's true, but it's impossible to get that through the FDA. So there are a lot of ways where the rules to really get below the covers of what the rules are make no sense at all and are really impeding the kind of progress we need.
But I think that raises a really interesting point in terms of if people are given the opportunity to understand the science and the technology, they can actually make really good decisions. And that's something that's not really made available to most people today. The risk analyses that go on, I mean, sometimes there's public hearings that the EPA holds, sometimes there's not. Depends on how hot the issue is. There's no mechanism in the government that forces them to consider the public debate at all. There's no mechanism to that where interested and affected parties, experts from different disciplines can come together and provide feedback. This despite the fact that there is tons of research for the last 20 years that shows that this kind of approach, a more democratic approach to looking at the risks, actually improves the quality of the research, improves the quality of the risk analysis, and makes for better decision making. So, it's interesting to take the perspective that, if the FDA would only listen to the activists, I mean, it would be great if the EPA listened to the activists too, and they don't seem to do that very much of that. So it's about, for me anyhow, it's about where where risk and technology come together at that fulcrum of regulation. Make it a more democratic process, make it more transparent, allow more appropriate people to have input into the process.
Well,
I was just going to say, what's interesting about what you were saying, Mr. Kurzweil, was you were, and I think it was interesting that the main pressure that the people were exerting was a political pressure. It was not as I understand it on AIDS anyway, was a political.
Well, let's take the specific. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but let's take this example that was in the paper today. 206 members of Congress wanting the president to change his executive order with regard to research on embryonic stem cell research, because now there are many more lines of research available. When Bush first issued this edict, I thought it was quite interesting and in some ways hypocritical, because I believed it was actually kind of cover for giving yet more away to the private sector, because this presidential order is really just about government research. It has nothing to do with what happens in the private sector. It has to do with taxpayer money or research that could be happening at the National Institutes of Health. So just for the sake of argument for a few minutes, how might there be other approaches, or what kind of analysis do you all think should be brought to bear in a decision about embryonic stem cell research?
I would open it up beyond the ethical issues, and that was one of the things that was, one of the things that distresses me about a lot of the biotech discussion is that it gets turned into a discussion about ethics versus whether you or not you believe in science, as opposed to, I think there's a lot more nuance to the conversation that has to do with social implications, legal implications, economic implications. That's the part of the conversation that ends up not happening at that level.
Well, President Bush's original position had to do with a very specific ethical issue, which has to do with embryos. And these are embryos even before implantation. This is embryos before, for example, they could split and produce two different human beings if they were to become twins. A lot of ethicists, even who are against abortion, don't believe actually that an embryo at that stage represents a human life. But anyway, that was the particular issue that was involved there. And I think with that issue and any of the other issues, we talked about the AIDS activists versus other disease groups, I think people can and they should learn this information on their own. This stuff is not that complicated that only experts can understand how breast cancer works or how AIDS works and how these conditions work. And we do see, particularly people that have chronic diseases now are organizing on the internet the way Howard has described, and become as expert, if not more so, than the physicians and the so-called experts. And these bureaucracies, the FDA and the APA, are reactive. I mean, will respond to political pressure. And I think the AIDS example was a very good one, because the AIDS activists became technical experts. They learned something very technical, the fact that you needed a cocktail approach. That's a technical insight. And they had that insight, and they saw that this was being blocked by the FDA because of regulations that were set decades ago where people didn't think you needed such approaches. And they organized very aggressively and got it through. Now, we don't see that in other diseases, maybe because AIDS activists are used to having to take a more proactive stance in society to establish their rights, that they were sort of used to doing this. Whereas, say, breast cancer patients don't have the same sort of attitude towards these authorities. But I would advocate that people really take responsibility for these situations, learn the science, it's not that hard to understand, and then deal with the political process we have, which does respond to political pressure and organization. And in fact, it can respond very quickly, as Howard has pointed out.
Well, and in fact, I think I'd like to take that opportunity to kind of shift into a conversation about the political implications of the new networks that we find ourselves embedded in, both in terms of activism and in terms of kind of the difference between individual and collective action that changes depending on the scale of the technology.
Well, I sense a couple of assumptions that a lot of people share, that I, for the most part, share underlying this conversation, that I think are worth examining. One of them being that there are anything close to effective institutions in something like the U.S. government to deal with the complexities of the technologies and of the ethical and economic and political issues without even making a decision based on what your political biases are, just even being able to see what all the components of those decisions are. We used to have something called the Office of Technology Assessment, which it can be argued about whether they were effective or not, but they tried to do what you're supposed to do in a democracy in regard to the kinds of decision-making that Congress needs to make, which is to say these are what the implications of these kinds of decisions might come to. It was the OTA had a budget of $28 million, which is pretty small, and it was zeroed out in the Gingrich Congress, first Gingrich Congress. So I think the assumption that the existing EPA and FDA and the president, that those are institutions that can cope with the scale and pace of change that we're talking about here, that's, I think, something we ought to look at. But also, I'm afraid that the assumption that there is a continuing democracy of knowledge and information and advocacy that will enable we the people to influence decisions about this is one that's very much questionable. Without getting into detail, I will note that both science and constitutional democracies are only a few hundred years old. They are forms of collective action that were enabled by the printing press, and the public sphere that underlies the notion that anyone who can read the literature, can do an experiment, and contribute to science, there are peer review and other filtering mechanisms, but essentially science is about many people building on each other's work to create something that is an aggregate public good that's valuable to all of us. That is very much under attack and in question by the way intellectual property regimes, the way the institutions like universities and research laboratories are being structured to conduct research, and the way regulation of access to information or deregulation of access to information is making it unavailable to a lot of people. In regard to the public sphere of democracy, we've had in the USA close to 300 years of very close relationship between a wild, chaotic, biased, inaccurate, wildcat, journalistic, newspaper history. And that is pretty much a now consolidated into wholly owned subsidiaries of the entertainment industry. Without getting into the discussion of who owns these things and what relationship they have to the political governors, the fact is that journalism, and it's appropriate to say to the journalism school, I've been appalled by my naivety in recently speaking with the people in charge of all of our journalistic media about how little they care about the role of journalism in informing citizens about what we need to know about simply to remain free, much less the complexities of the issues of biotechnology, and how very much they care about the pressure they're getting from their owners about the fact that their traditional business models are crumbling. So I think if you take the assumptions that we've got to kind of democratize science and we've got some way of dealing with scientific decisions that has evolved over the years, and the assumption that we the people have some input into this and some knowledge of what's going on, I think both of those are worth questioning. I would say that the only really strong hope, given the immense forces at play here, that I see is that, like the printing press, the access to technologies we carry enables a lot of people to get in on political and other conversations they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. The SARS epidemic being a great example of a central government that's used to being able to exert top-down control over the news, tried to keep a lid on the SARS outbreaks from the beginning, but because 150 million people sent text messages about the rumors they were hearing over 3 days, it was impossible to keep the lid on. Now, some of those rumors in the future are not going to be true, they're not going to be particularly beneficial for people, but at the same time that we have this enormous concentration of a small number of people making important decisions about the future of technology and science, we have technologies cracking open access to both the political and the scientific sphere. So to me, the missing ingredient, what you have, if you don't already have power, you don't already have wealth, is what you know. So I will admit to a Enlightenment era bias in regard to that kind of rationality, that I think that despite the problems that the rationalization and scientific analysis and technologization of society have brought us, it's really our only bulwark against superstition and madness.
Well, I take heart in the access, the incredibly broad and deep access to the internet, and the things that you talk about in your book, Smart Mobs for Organizing Under the Radar Screen, which I think is going to be particularly important in this election year. People are interested in seeing change, because how do you penetrate the monolithic major media, and maybe new technologies are actually affording us an opportunity to have an impact at a grassroots level, but reaching lots of people, smart mobbed and networked out there. And I'm wondering if some of the journalists up here have something to say about that.
I would just add to, I think I would add to this notion of the importance of knowledge. I'm behind, but I think the next part of it is you got to be able to add teeth to the knowledge. So you got the knowledge, great. So what are the mechanisms by which you can utilize that knowledge to actually create change or start something or to have an impact, basically? And I think back to these technologies that we're talking about, we've kind of mythologized a little bit the FDA and the EPA and all that. I mean, these are chronically understaffed, underfunded, and under-intellectually based organizations that have extremely limited perspective on what is considered acceptable and what is not acceptable, because their criteria as to what constitutes success is extremely limited. The legal system itself has been completely outpaced by the realities impelled forward by the technologies we're talking about. If we're talking, let's say, about genetic engineering, the legal system had no capability to deal with the new concept of genetic contamination. What do you do when you say American farmers, for example, have lost, let's say, $1 billion over the last 5 years in sales overseas that they can't sell because their crops get contaminated? So, fine, that's an economic story, but actually it's a legal story. It's a fascinating legal question, because there are no laws. There's no legal mechanisms by which anybody can be held accountable for that question. So it doesn't get registered in the cost column of the equation when one's assessing the benefits and costs of a particular technology. And another example of how technology tends to challenge and upend and existing means of regulation is the shipping industry, of all things, which I know a little bit about. And the shipping industry, for example, technologically speaking, the principles of the shipping industry were established in the 18th century, basically Dutch and British shipping. And essentially, the questions of liability and what you do with sunken ships is based on 18th century principles of navigation and freedom of the seas, and et cetera, et cetera. So that existed when what was carried on ships was bullion and chickens and horses and slaves. But now we've got a system which carries radioactive material. We've got a system that carries an entirely new array of technological elements, and oil, radioactive material, chemicals, et cetera, that have the potential to cause massive damage over massive areas of land and the sea, and yet there are no legal mechanisms. The existing structures of the maritime system, for example, have no legal means of obtaining accountability for the damage that are caused by this technology. So I just raised that as a way, not simply to raise these particular examples, but to raise this kind of ebb and flow tension that exists between new technological innovation and the means to regulate it, and the question which you raised very nicely is the kind of power of information. But information alone needs to have mechanisms to enforce the knowledge that information gives you, and I think that's what's seriously lacking,
Well, if I could get back to what Howard talked about in the consolidation of power of publishers, and Howard also mentioned the counterweight to that, which is the growing decentralization of distributed communication, which the internet is an exemplary example of. The internet really is very democratizing, and decentralized electronic communication in general is very democratizing. You saw the first example of that in the 1991 coup against Gorbachev, when the new authorities used the typical approach of grabbing the centralized radio and television commands, expecting that would keep everybody in the dark and they would be able to maintain totalitarian control. And we really saw the first emergence of a democratic political impact of decentralized communication, with early email using teletype machines and fax machines, and a whole clandestine network of communication that kept everybody in the know. We were not able to keep the public in the dark, and it was not the Elson bravely standing on a tank that overturned that revolution. It was really this new phenomenon of people being in touch, and it just kind of blew away totalitarian control, and the Soviet Union crumbled. And we really do see this democratizing effect, not only politically, but at every different level. I mentioned earlier chronic disease groups where people will come into their doctor's office very knowledgeable because they're connected to a whole worldwide network of people who are intensely interested in some situation because they're directly affected by it. And that is the alternative to this consolidation of power. We really do have millions of stations now, and the opportunity for everybody to stay in touch. And it's not true that a small number of people control technology at all. The new technologies bubble up from a whole ferment of many thousands, hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs who are experimenting with ideas. And so you have a couple of students at another local university here in Stanford who cook up something in their dorm room and it becomes, a multi-tens of billions of dollars venture, Google. And that happens all the time. These new ideas do not necessarily come, in fact, they rarely come from the major corporate R&D labs.
Well, what I fear is that our assumption that the freedom of innovation that the internet has enabled in the past is going to continue into the future, and that the hope, and I think perhaps naive optimism that a lot of people have that the distributed architecture of the internet would ensure that it could not be controlled from a central point, that there's some people with a lot at stake who've put a lot of thought into how they actually could control it, and we are seeing legislation and regulation from the broadcast flag to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act now being contemplated to be baked in to the next generations of computers. The cable providers of broadband have requested the deregulation of the requirement that they not discriminate among the packets that they carry. Our colleagues who are here from China, I think, can tell us that it is possible to install routers in an entire nation that will allow some bits in and some bits out. I know that if too much control is exerted over who can contribute to the innovation on the internet, then we're not going to see the value that we've seen over it in the past. But I'm afraid that the people who are driving the legislation, it's not just the U.S., it's the World Intellectual Property Organization, it's a whole web of international treaties, and if it's baked into the next version of Windows, it's going to be everywhere in the world. I don't want to argue that we're being naively optimistic. I want to argue that we are not automatically going to maintain this tremendous democratization of ideas and the ability to start a business in your dorm room and the ability for people to make scientific discoveries out there. The tools that we have in our hands are enormously powerful scientific devices as well. That I hope that I'm being a little bit too nervous about this. I would like us to preserve that.
Wait a minute, I think...
It's a legitimate issue to some of the...
to a lot of it. But wait, Denise, I think Denise wanted
that you're talking about
to respond.
To do with intellectual property protection. I mean, the information is becoming a more and more important component of the value of products and services, and ultimately is going to asymptote to nearly our entire economy. And we have a crisis in copyright protection. I mean, the downloading of songs is one small indication, but it does take capital formation and viable business models to create these intellectual properties, whether it's software or movies or songs. It actually takes a lot of money, and if we can't protect it...
Ray, I'm appalled that you've fallen for this. It's astonishing. It's the only thing that in regard to property that's in the Constitution gives a reason for why the copyright protection was, in order to ensure progress in the sciences and the arts. It's not about only protecting property. It's about incenting people to create things that others can build upon. And you know what? We wouldn't have radio playing music if that problem had not been solved. I could care less about the business model of the Motion Picture Association and the recording industry. Certainly, I think you will agree that we can come up with a technology solution that will enable people to share culture peer-to-peer and pay the people who create that culture without having to deal with the archaic mechanisms of distribution that were based on the fact that you could put it in a can and you could guard that can. I mean,
but in terms of patents and copyright, in the first instance, it wasn't about enclosure. It was about inspiring creativity, promoting the opportunity and the incentive for people to go out and imagine and design and invent new things. But I also think that it need not be a black or white issue. I was a lawyer in a former life. Property law affords all kinds of ways to describe how people can relate to objects, all kinds of ways of ownership that are sort of prohibiting. Some in fact do prohibit other people from using something, and others involve ways of sharing it. Denise, you
in terms of, I mean, if you look at the biology world and biotech, actually, innovation is actually in danger of being totally stifled by intellectual property laws now, because everything gets patented now in the university lab before it gets spun out, and there aren't going to be able to be people in garages doing biotech, because this has already turned into the level of war that you saw in the technology world after 20 or 30 years, where IBM would have a dueling patent portfolio with Motorola, and you wouldn't, there's this whole thing which I thought was so funny. It sounded like a military metaphor, which it probably is. This whole idea of freedom to operate. And biotech companies talk about freedom to operate now, about whether they can get licensed to other people's patents to do the most basic kind of research. And for as much as I think that we should be very smart about how we move forward in this area, I think that there are a couple of things I want to say. One, I think that it's clear that the intellectual property laws are totally broken when it comes to this kind of stuff. And the second thing, to sort of back up to 35,000 feet and go back to what both Howard and Mark were saying, is that we've got this technology. Let's just assume internet, okay? Let's just assume it, even though probably it's not necessarily a good assumption given all the crap that's going on right now. But let's assume open access internet. The thing that's interesting is the paradox of that is that people become very specialized in what they focus on and what they look for. So you have this broadly democratic medium, only democratic in some ways, because what happens is that people self-select into special interest groups. So what is interesting to me is if what we're talking about here is that we need to figure out a way to change how regulations are done. Well, it sounds like every single regulatory agency is busted. I would vote for that. I think that that's true. So how do you instigate an uprising using a democratic medium when people are gathering based on whether or not they have breast cancer, AIDS, or Parkinson's? How do you get people to understand that the whole system is broken and get them to sort of move en masse to do that? I think that's really, really difficult. And I think that's, that brings in, that's about social motivation and cultural motivation. It's different in the U.S. than it is in other places in the world. And the thing that I get the most concerned about in terms of media in this country is that it seems like there's a very thick crust that it's almost impossible to break through on a grassroots level. It's hard to get things. I mean, look what Move On had to go through to get national attention for what they were doing. And who knows whether it's going to actually make a difference or not. I'm really curious in these mechanisms of change.
It's not sufficient to just have people decide that regulation or some system like the FDA or EPA is broken. Fixing these issues is very complex.
Well, that's what I'm saying, right? I'm saying if everybody's protecting their own special interest, it's never going to happen.
The only way we're really going to make progress is for the constituencies to have a much more sophisticated understanding of the issues and the science and the impact, and not just realizing that it's broken. We're not going to stop technological progress. The only way we can do that would be braving the world totalitarian system. That was the thesis of that novel. The idea of technological progress is very thoroughly integrated into our notions of freedom, and it's not going to change. Things are going to become more complex, and there's no substitute for the public and the various broad constituencies to become much more sophisticated in understanding these issues, and not expect to get spoon-fed this knowledge by government agencies that can seek it on their own.
Was I saying that? Did I say that?
One thing that came up on patents, and one thing that
Did
I
I say
think
we should
should change.
people?
We
Okay.
talked about how the pace of change is accelerating, and yet we have a fixed 20-year term for patents. Now, 20 years used to be figured, well, that's enough because that's almost a generation of technology. So you'd have almost a generation of technology to utilize your invention. Then it became one generation. Now it's about 4 or 5 generations. A generation of technology is maybe 5 or 6 years, and it's going to become 3 or 4 years. So the significance of 20 years is becoming greater and greater. And it doesn't change as the pace of science and technology changes.
Well, it's full of paradoxes, isn't it? I mean, the significance of 20 years is greater and greater on the one hand, and on the other hand, as you yourself and everybody has said, technological development is happening at an exponentially increasing rate.
Which would argue for shorter, not longer.
I think also, and now that we've talked about the public, I think I'd like to bring this public into the room a bit, but I think we also live with the paradoxes of of how amazing the internet is, and yet it gets used to proliferate rumors about, toothpaste and shampoo that cause cancer. I mean, something comes over the internet, and discriminating wisdom is not much applied, in my experience, to the content. And to use the MoveOn example, on the one hand, yes, it's true, it may have taken the national media a long time to get hip to MoveOn. MoveOn probably didn't care whether the national media ever got hip to MoveOn, because what, in fact, they've been able to establish at a grassroots level is incredible. And they've had a number of successes in the years since they've been in existence with elections at a state and local level. It'll be interesting to see what kind of an impact they have in a national election, which now, interestingly enough, as we watch technology insinuate itself into absolutely every aspect of our lives, plays a very significant role as the Federal Elections Commission determines how people can relate to each other, what kind of media can be used for what kinds of purposes, and of course, facing the issue of electronic voting machines. So it's with us at every moment of our lives on every issue every day. But now we would like to encourage you all to join us in this conversation. We are hoping for questions rather than statements, and there are people wandering around with mics. So if you will raise your hand, I'll kind of point out 2 people at a time, and we'll see if we can make this move. So why don't we start here, and then you'll be second.
Since this is an election year, I'd be interested in the panelists commenting on what national goals they would like to see candidates articulate in this election season. President Bush has put one on the table of sending someone to Mars at some unspecified
about that, I think.
Point in the future. But I'm wondering if there are other national goals related to science and technology that you would find more compelling.
Well, I have one actually that I've been articulating that I really think should be a major goal. I mean, I talked in my opening remarks about promise and peril, and we do have this unfolding biotechnology revolution. Bill Joy wrote this article about GNR, genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics, but the technology that's here today is not nanotechnology or super intelligent robots, but we do have biotechnology. Right here at Berkeley, a student can go create a designer virus. This technology will be very beneficial, and we are close at hand in overcoming many diseases, but obviously the potential for abuse is quite terrifying. And we can't relinquish our way out of this. I mean, we're not going to tell the millions of cancer sufferers we're close to saving millions of lives, but we're going to cancel all that because all things too dangerous. And it really is a race. We're actually also close at hand in having effective antiviral technologies, new medications that could stop viruses. And we need to keep the defensive technologies a couple of steps ahead of the offensive ones. And it really is a race. It should be the highest national priority. I propose that we have a program of 1% of GDP, which would be $100 billion, to specifically aimed at this existential threat against humanity, which right now is designer viruses, so that we can assure that we stay a couple of steps ahead of the offensive use. And we also need to streamline the regulations. A bioterrorist does not have to put his inventions through the FDA, but all the scientists that we're counting on to defend ourselves do have to go through this ponderous 10-year process, and it's not going to work. We really have to realize that have more of a war mentality on this issue.
I think we should. I think number one, the opposition to President Bush should demand a trip to Saturn, so we're not just left with Mars. Damn it! Yeah, let's get ourselves to Saturn in our lifetime. But I think probably one of the things they could do is ask for an honest scientific policy in which political pressures are not exerted on the scientific establishment. As we've known several months ago, the reports came out about the intense pressures, political pressures being put on the regulatory agencies in terms of scientific data being generated on global warming and a whole host of other things. So I think whoever this the candidate is, it looks pretty clear who it is, one of the things they could do is actually ask for a opening of the regulatory mechanisms to honest scientific assessments that actually take into account many of the multifarious forces that weigh in on whether or not a product is safe or not safe or whatever. And I would just add one little thing to this discussion. I don't think we want to get into like anti-technology. Nobody in this room is anti-technology. I mean, this is, we're not.
We live by it.
We're not
every
Luddites.
day.
We live with it every day. We got the phones. We got the computers. We got, thank God for the great medicines and everything. I mean, this is not an anti-technology question. It's a question of the kind of questions and the sort of assessments we can make as to the long-term implications and what's worth pursuing, what's not worth pursuing, and the mechanisms by which you do that. So
I would propose
one
answer to that question. One, my favorite one. I think that there are a lot of other things that an intelligent candidate could say about technology, but let's bring back a bipartisan institution funded for the cost of one jet fighter, which would be probably a 20-fold increase over the Office of Technology Assessment budget, and make sure that the congressional oversight of it, as the OTA was, will ensure nonpartisanship. And I think we have, the OTA did a good job of getting a great cross-section of citizens and experts and people from all over the political spectrum together to have discussions. They made reports, and they were read essentially by 25-year-old congressional aides who told their bosses how they really wanted to vote on something. Ultimately, all these decisions are political. I think the best we can do is to make sure that there's some reality in regard to what the beliefs of the decision makers are about what the options mean. We have something now that we didn't have in the early 1990s, and that's 1 million bloggers and growing out there who are going to take this stuff out of the reports that are only read by the congressional aides and bubble them up to where they might become news again.
So we're going to go to this gentleman and then down here, and then we'll come back up to you. Oh, okay, well, he's passing the microphone. Make it quick.
I would add to that, I would actually like to see an Office of Biological Policy Assessment, and I think their first job should be to look at the potential of what you might call open source biology to address issues around bioterrorism and innovation in the private sector around biotechnology. And in terms of what Howard was saying about the blogging, here's one of the great sadnesses of the work I've done in the last 2 years, which is that the National Academy of Sciences publishes the most wonderful reports constantly on stuff that's so good, and nobody ever sees them. And, certainly nobody in politics pays any attention to them. And they're really good. They're the top people in their field. They're peer-reviewed up the nose. They're sterling. And it's very hard to get more than, a couple of inches in the New York Times. The one that I remember particularly was the one on animal biotechnology, where the opening, where the summation, the guy who was the chair of it, the eminent scientist whose name I can't remember right now, said, "We are more nervous about this now than we were when we started this study." Did you see that anywhere? I didn't see that anywhere. The information is out there. We should be telling the blog community that this is out. It's actually, all this stuff's on the web now.
That's why you need to finish your book.
I need to finish my book. Okay, I gotta go.
You need to be the person blogging.
What time is it? I gotta go.
Sir.
So my question may be a bit radical, but I'll throw it out there anyway. Should we reconceptualize the role of the press in educating the public? Currently, the press does not see itself as an online interactive learning environment. Specifically, the press isn't engaged in assessing the level of reader/student competence and understanding of basic policy issues. Our paradigm of democracy does not take into account or into consideration the level of specific voter competence or on specific issues. Perhaps the basic problem may be with our paradigm of democracy and the role of education in the press. So should we consider giving more voting power to people who have no more knowledge on specific issues?
I think we should give more power to the press, more power to journalists. Yeah, a greater vote, 1.5 votes in each election.
Oh God.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure you want a lot of people telling journalists what to do. You just have to establish a free press. Hopefully, there's laws protecting us and that's right.
Well, there is this thing called the public education system that could be taking care of some of those issues as well.
Maybe
They're
that's
not
good.
doing
Thank
very
you,
well.
Denise. Yeah, good education system.
I mean, if you have to learn about, policy from the newspapers, you're starting in the wrong place.
Sir.
Hello, my name is Paul Gottlieb, and this is in response to Mr. Kurzweil's comments about all those cancer patients, and wouldn't they rather not have had cancer? Well, yes, sir, I have had cancer, and I've been studying all of these toxicants in our environment now for about 12 years. I'm not a scientist. It took me a long time to learn. And I can say categorically that most or all maybe are caused by these technologies that are supposed to cure them or make our lives easier. These things that are not regulated in any meaningful way, let's say the toxicologists are just coming up to date possibly, and they have been, let's say in the 16th century with Paracelsus, up until maybe 10 years ago. So don't you think that the corporate patent owners just see the people, the consumers, as a means of getting rich? And don't you see that the corporations not only has more rights than the person, but that it also has, and it only has one purpose in mind, and that is to make money without conscience? Thank you.
Do you want to respond, Ray?
Well, I think there's a lot more we can do in terms of limiting toxins in our environment. I certainly wouldn't defend the system we have for environmental pollution. It's certainly a major contributor to cancer. At the same time, there's a lot that people can do themselves to avoid cancer. Actually, I have a book coming out on that subject this fall. In terms of nutrition, people eat diets that are very bad for them in terms of pro-inflammatory fats and very high in sugar and high-glycemic starches, all of which are accelerate cancer formation and so on. So I think a cancer program to eliminate cancer would include, as you say, dramatic reductions in toxins in all levels of our environment. People understanding more what they can do in terms of their own lifestyle, controlling obesity and so forth, all of which are enormous contributors to cancer. And then there is, but people will still get cancer, and we're going to want more effective treatments, which are in the pipeline. So I think we will make progress there as well, and I think that's something we also want to accelerate.
But I think you make a very important point about how innovation is driven for curing diseases or treating diseases, and I mean, I'm not the first person to say it, but it's always seemed interesting to me that after all the billions of dollars that has been spent on cancer, what we mostly have now are drugs to treat cancer. We haven't stepped back, and I shouldn't say we here and include myself in this, but most of the research money goes to treatment, not to finding out causes. And if you wanted to be a conspiracy theorist, which is of course really easy to do, you could think about why that is, and if there's not only no money, but you're taking away an industry. Let's just say that possibly some form of processed food or something, great amounts of it causes cancer. I'm making this up, whatever.
Well, it's absolutely true.
Well, okay, but wait, let me finish. I'm in the middle of a sentence here. So why would anyone want, in the processed food industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, why would you want to fund research that would basically put you out of business? Pharma companies make a lot of money with, having patients. Why don't we have a cure for diabetes yet? Better than cancer. Because you can have it forever. And, why isn't there a cure for diabetes yet? I don't know. It's really actually pretty lucrative to treat it for 20 or 30 or 50 or 60 years. So I think, ways to look at the mechanisms that research is funded to look at how we can improve what kinds of research get funded for these issues would be pretty welcome as well.
Well, I think we could fruitfully have a whole other conversation that just is about medicine and technology and what drives medical research. There's a story a couple of years ago. I don't know how many of you saw this. There's a part of Africa where sleeping sickness is the highest, causes the greatest deaths, and there is actually a cure for the sleeping sickness. One that's not so high-tech, extremely painful, works 50% of the time, and another that actually is extremely effective, but extremely effective because, like the AIDS drugs in Africa, this is not a country that has the ability to afford the drugs for the people who need it. Interestingly enough, another company that was making a depilatory found that this product, which they're selling God knows how many jars of for hair removal in the United States, cured this sleeping sickness. And so hairless legs all over this country and perhaps all over the world are incidentally curing sleeping sickness because it became worth it for the company developing the product because they actually found a market for it. On the other hand, my niece lives in Italy. I was participating actually in a UN conference on healthy eating and sugar, and our own government was adamant that sugar not be named as a culprit in any kind of disease, and withdrew significant funding. I can only imagine because the sugar industry was not in support. You had a question up there in the blue. And then we'll go up to Ignacio. And then here. Okay, sorry. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, wait.
I think if each of you might want to take a different take on this, but could you please comment on where you think the line between public and private is going to be going? You sort of addressed it in different ways, whether it's issues of public health versus the innovations that private companies want to do, whether that's public information being available to scientists and to members of the general public on how some of these things are developed, on government decisions and how they're made, and at the same time maybe less and less privacy for individuals as far as where they're going on the internet, who's reading your email, and where do you think those lines are going?
I think we have to have a conversation about it. I mean, I think that the lines are shifting and they're going to be different in different places under different circumstances. I think there's a whole conversation that I know Chris and I have spent some time talking about over the past year or so about what are the commons? What are the things that we need to think about in terms of our culture that are for the common good? What things go into that pool, and how do you navigate that, and how do you make sure that there's still plenty of steam and plenty of incentive for innovation and for private companies to do what they need to do without hampering the public? I mean, it's the Bayh-Dole Act is a legislation that was passed in the 70s to spur technology transfer out of the universities into the private sector. And it may have done its job so well that we need to rethink it now, because what's happening is that, you guys probably experienced this as students here. It's hard to find money for basic research now. It's really a lot easier to find money for research that gets funneled into things that can be commercialized. That's taxpayer money. I'm paying for that. I think we need to have the conversation.
Do you want to respond to that?
Well,
Oh, sorry, I would just add that, one, Denise hit on the public-private blurring of that distinction, often in public universities such as this one and other ones, in terms of where the research is coming from, and that certainly has become a substantial issue now as to where the priorities are lied. And I would also, as certain people in this audience are deeply familiar with, but also I would actually say that there's another aspect to this, which is the public and private question of where the profit is and where the price is. So you have essentially the privatization of profit, but you actually have the society itself often taking the risk. So in fact, in a perfect free market setup, you've got companies that take enormous risks, and it takes a huge amount of risk to come up with a new project and put money in and everything like that. And yet in a true free market, that entity, whatever it was, would also have to deal with the risk, with the problems that whatever it is that product would create. Well, in fact, in a lot of ways, the current setup often has the producer, the privatization, the private interest obtains the profit, but the risk from the disasters or the problems or the exposure or the environment or the health effects or whatever it might be are socialized, which means essentially us, and we end up paying that damage. So I think there's kind of been there's another aspect of this public-private dynamic that you raise.
there's a lot of misinformation that's being propagated by people who ought to know better in regard to some of these arguments I discussed about the privatization of the internet or the way intellectual property laws are going to treat the capabilities of the internet. There was a kind of scurrilous report from the Cato Institute a while back in which they equated collective action and the commons with collectivism and communism. And I think that a really simple analogy is that private innovation, private enterprise has driven innovation enormously on the internet because the platform for innovation has been treated as a public good and a commons. So the fact that nobody can prevent you from starting a website, that technically, because they can't exclude you, the internet is treated as a commons, did not prevent the Google guys from becoming billionaires. A lot of other people from creating valuable private property on the basis of that commons. And I think that those arguments are being repeated over again with the wireless spectrum. And for the most part, I certainly didn't understand this until I was educated about it by Larry Lessig and others. Most of us don't really understand the interplay between public goods and platforms and private innovation and enterprise.
Ignacio?
Yeah, I wanted to raise the question of inevitability and governability as a duality. We seem to be ushering here, even when we critique the rapid development of technologies, we're just ushering them as though they were inevitable. And I would really like to challenge that concept. And at the same time, I would like to question, as we usher this accelerating development of technology, do we see even a parallel development of governance structures. Where are the institutions? Who is there to parallel that? And shouldn't we be ushering or trying to harness the development of technology to the natural pace of development of our institutions that would be able to govern? It seems to me that we've already, even this conversation, we've signed off media, we've signed off government, we've signed off everybody else, and I would like to know who's left to represent the public and to represent. I'm sorry?
When did we sign off media?
Oh, you were trying to get us to Saturn with 1.5 votes for the journalists. And,
What's your point?
So the question is, who's left? And, I really want to stick to the banner until the end that this place, like a public university, would be the place where this could happen. And yet, at the same time, it's incredibly challenging. So I would like to hear what you think about it.
Well, if I could take a stab at that. First, on the inevitability, I do think that continued progress is inevitable unless we drastically change our social system to a totalitarian one. The reason that the technologies accelerate is we use one stage of technology to create the next. So the next stage goes more quickly, and the fruits of that stage are more powerful. And this actually goes back to biological evolution. The first stage took billions of years, and then we had DNA. So evolution had a little computer to track its experiments, and the next stage went relatively quickly. It took about 10 million years, the Cambrian explosion, and later on Homo sapiens evolved in a few 100,000 years. And then evolution used Homo sapiens to bring in the next stage, which was technology. The first stages of that took tens of thousands of years, and 500 years ago the printing press took a century to be adopted, and now things like the World Wide Web get adopted in a few years' time. So technology accelerates with each stage, uses the more powerful tools of the later stage to create the next. And I do think it does create great challenges to our social institutions, because our social institutions inherently change more slowly. Universities are a prime part of society to deal with these issues, because I don't think we can deal with these issues without a lot of intelligence and knowledge and reasons debate. And the universities are ideally set up for that. We need a more educated populace. We don't just leave war decisions to the generals, and we shouldn't just leave technology decisions to the engineers. It requires an educated populace to address these issues.
Yeah, I think that I would respond to your perhaps somewhat rhetorical question that who is left is us. Of course, you're familiar, but for those who aren't, there's a wonderful essay in this book by a man named Shiv Viswanathan, who's an Indian anthropologist, and he advocates something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for making decisions about science and technology, and that the participants in such a commission ought not to be the experts, nor should they be Luddites, but they should be informed members of a community who are thinking about these issues and making decisions about how and whether to move forward. And not necessarily saying no, but saying we don't know enough yet, making the kinds of decisions that help establish parameters that allow us to move forward with intelligence. I mean, I don't think that it's a question of inevitability or not. I have spoken with Bill Joy over the years about his position on things, and I don't think that we should put a black box around any aspect of human knowledge or curiosity. Perhaps we should put a serious limitation, a serious bar with those things that we move forward with. But in terms of the knowledge, the pure science, and I know there are people who would disagree with that as well. I mean, I think it's a wonderful, fascinating thing. To me, it's the point of being human, but also the point of being human, again, to borrow a phrase from the Buddhists, is to exercise both wisdom and compassion, to have some discriminating wisdom about how we behave, and some understanding of the consequences that might ensue insofar as we can see them. Obviously, we're blinded. It's the unanticipated consequences that get us every time, and they will continue to. I think we have time maybe for 3 more. There was a question here, and then this will be the last one. Sir.
I'll try to be very quick. It's a brilliant
Wait.
panel.
Wait for the microphone. We can't hear you.
Yeah, right here. We couldn't hear you.
Hello, is that working now? I'll try to be quick.
Still speak loudly. It's hard to hear.
Louder? Okay. First of all, I'm blogging this panel. I just posted some photos and observations and random quotes at thepowerofmany.com. Thepowerofmany.com. And actually, one thing is, a lot of talk is about how do you regulate or head off or fight against or stop or take time to decide about all these things that are accelerating towards some liftoff point that's scary. And I think, and we were just getting to the point of saying we can't wait for the government, we can't wait for the engineers, we can't wait for the businessmen, we can't let the generals make the decisions. We're not going to have a guru or a leader or a pharaoh or somebody who's going to tell us at the top of a pyramid how to deal with all these new things. It's the 21st century. We have to make up our own organizational systems as we go. And so that it does come down to us, literally, that we're not going to have to, I mean, we have to go to Washington and do the dance there and do everything else you have to do. But meanwhile, I think Howard was talking about why can't they take the money for the equivalent of one fighter jet program and put that into scientific understanding or technological research or improving of the way, I don't want to paraphrase you incorrectly, but the idea of tithing a little bit of money, which is actually a lot for what we want to do. I also think it's just people will tithe their own time. People will say, I'm going to spend 1 hour a week trying to dump Bush or something like that. Or I'm going to spend an hour in a week figuring out why these interfaces are so sucky and making them better or something like that. So I think there's a lot that's going to happen just because people are going to realize they can do it. They don't need a job or a salary or health care or a lifelong job promise from somebody else to work together and act. That's just my hobby horse. One last little thing. I do think that we don't know. It is scary when things start to change so quickly. There's this Frankenstein fear. The scientists are reassuring us that everything's cool, it's under control. But I don't trust those people. I wouldn't trust myself in that situation. There's always unintended consequences. There's always this fear that we're going to unravel the whole sweater or something like that. And I think it's we should listen to all the wise people who are saying, let's not be so hasty.
I'll make a little comment about that. There are ways to approach this issue that you're talking about in terms of how do you look at a problem, and how do you learn to trust the scientists. And this is some of the research I was talking about that the national academies have done. There are processes that have been developed where you bring a group of scientists into a room, not all from the same discipline. They come together, they talk about these things, they come up with a research agenda that addresses more concerns. You bring interested and affected parties into the conversation, you bring stakeholders into the process. It's not innovation by committee, it's actually very useful. There's lots of research that's been done about value of information analyses and how you improve a scientific agenda by bringing people into the process. And that's one of the things that happened with John Losey and the BT Monarch Pollan thing, was that one little good thing that happened out of it was that a whole bunch of people who freaked out when this happened all came together for a meeting at Cornell and came up with a research agenda. How do we make sure that this doesn't happen again? Why that didn't happen in the first place is a problem.
And also, to the extent that universities play an important role in all of this, in educating people and in moving these issues forward, I think that interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity is a very important thing, and that is not something, it's very much what Denise is doing with Hybrid Vigor, and it isn't something that is terribly encouraged, to my knowledge, in universities where people, to use the popular term of art, exist in their silos and do not much reach out, not only to, if it's in the sciences, other scientists, much less people in the humanities, the history department, linguistics, wherever it might be.
We actually have really important things to say.
If I could comment on that.
Okay, and then up there and then down here. Ray.
I think an important point to make with regard to this concern that we might be unleashing something that unravels the sweater is that many of the developments we're talking about do both. They have both promise and peril at the same time. To some extent, Bill Joy has backed off his strong relinquishment position. I don't want to speak for him, but I think it's become apparent that the technologies that are beneficial are the same technologies that have the peril. The ability to splice genes together to create new viruses has tremendous potential to cure disease and also to cause disease. I think an observation there is, and I think you can make a strong argument, and I would argue strongly, that these developments are going to happen. They are happening. RNA interference has already happened. We can turn off genes. It's a wonderful thing, but it also has some grave dangers. So really what I would advocate is that we need to accelerate the defensive side of the equation. We need to put a much higher priority in the universities in terms of learning about these things, but also in terms of just major funding to expressly develop the defensive technologies. And if you take software viruses as a sort of small case example, we have more and more sophisticated viruses, we have more and more sophisticated defensive technologies. So far, the software viruses have caused damage, but it's been a fairly small fraction of the benefit we get. But there's a difference between our experience there and what we see in the biological realm, is that we don't have an FDA approving software. There's no regulation in software. And the regulation actually is a danger in the biological and medical sciences, because it's not going to hold up the terrorists, but it is going to hold up the defensive technologies, and we really need to address that.
Sir.
Hello? As a former member of the OTA, it was a pleasure to hear the ghost resurrected and praised briefly. I really, at this point, given this comment just now, would only want to echo that as a question. So I found, having been in or seen these kind of conversations for really decades now, this almost a rather nostalgically quaint conversation from a more innocent era, in the sense that not that these concerns are illegitimate.
We're glad you came anyway.
Well, now hold on. I haven't finished the question. Don't assume it's an attack. These are appropriate concerns. My question to you all is, this is titled Living with the Genie, namely that our central concern is the unintended consequences as we release the genie from the bottle. I wonder if the new kid on the block isn't what our virtual persona said today, namely the intentional living creature, namely living with the devil, those who deliberately now wish to create destruction, that we now have a technological trend that gives individuals or very small groups of people great potential for, as you said, designer viruses. So, as opposed to unintended. So my question is, does the rest of the panel, we heard something coming perhaps from the East Coast, the rest of the panel believe that this is a significant trend or it's a minor tune in the larger unintended genie consequences?
I think it's definitely a major trend, and it's one of the reasons why the Office of Biological Policy Assessment, where I'd be so lucky to make that happen somehow, would deal with bioterrorism as well. I mean, it is the same side. It's two sides of the same coin. And what we don't seem to be willing to deal with is contingencies. We're not thinking about, these things are going to happen if the genie's out of the bottle. What are we going to do? You know, there are some the people who I know people in Berkeley, in fact, who defend the country from biological attack, who that's what they think about. It's like, what do we do? What are we going to do? So yeah, I mean, I think that that's really important. But I also actually think that you can look at it as two sides of the same coin and use that kind of knowledge and learning to expand potential knowledge for how you deal with all kinds of risks in this realm.
And of course, it's incredibly important. And one of the first questions that comes to my mind is, to what extent are we willing to limit democracy? Are we willing to limit the freedom that is so important, that defines civil society, in order to maybe stave off people that are going to find any way that they can to wreak destruction, if that's their intention? The consequences and the scale of that destruction are much greater, perhaps, now than they ever have been. But they're not different than what happens when, you know, a lone gunman goes up and goes out and shoots up a school or a post office. So the weapons at hand have greater consequences, perhaps. But I think it's a problem of humanity that has existed from time immemorial. I in no way want to diminish the significance of what you're raising.
Follow up or not?
Yeah. We're very limited in time.
Do you see the obvious response is control technologies to track people? Since a very small number of individuals could do a lot of destruction, then you have to watch a lot of people. Do the panelists, I would love to hear, see any practical alternatives, as alluded to with $100 million or whatever it was, $100 million programs to control technologies to stop small groups of people? I mean, we're not worrying about the Soviet Union anymore. We're worrying about 10 people doing something unpleasant.
Well, I would advocate, rather than trying to track everybody, which would be a big step towards a totalitarian system, that we develop the defensive technologies. I mean, we have a good case example with software viruses. Now, you might say software viruses aren't that harmful, but in fact, software is starting to run more and more things, to have intensive care units, airplanes, weapons that are controlled by software. And software viruses could be deadly. The damage that's been done so far has been relatively small compared to the benefit. I think we're doing fairly well. And it is a race. The viruses get more and more sophisticated, more powerful. The defensive technologies respond apace. I mentioned $100 billion, 1% of GDP, aimed at what I think is a current existential threat. And that's what I would advocate. I think we can keep the defensive technologies several steps ahead so that we can deal as effectively with some new virus as we did with SARS. Maybe hopefully even more effectively. But we did pretty well with that because of the advance of technology. The fact that we could sequence SARS in 2 or 3 weeks. I think we have to accept the fact that it's a race and put a few more stones on the scale of defense by investing in the defensive technologies and streamlining the regulatory aspect.
So I think one last question. It's after midnight where Ray is, and we really appreciate your staying up with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much. Perhaps it's one last sort of philosophical question, if I may ask, and a short comment. When we say about continued progress is inevitable, I'm thinking from a global perspective and also coming from a third world. What do we mean by progress? What are we talking here? Because you see, we are really fine making into a sort of a fetish this idea of progress. This is very Western notion of progress, Judeo-Christian tradition, etc. I don't want to go into the whole history of science on this and history of thought. And there is a question also here. We talk a lot about terrorism, but we don't ever ask why. We always think there is a techno-fix for everything. And I'm not a neo-Luddite, not a techno-utopian by any means. I have a long roster of government service, international service, teaching, whatever. So I'm not in that position, but I'm saying that we have to come to a far more sophisticated conversation today. We cannot have a society like this one that is completely benefiting from the globalization process of capitalism, not looking intelligently at the rest of the world, and saying that the only answer that we have is technological fixes at airports and techno bombs or smart bombs or this or that. I'm not against developing capacities for that, of course not. Who is for terrorism? Nobody. But I'm saying we have to ask fundamental questions. The political economy, the political ecology, the cultural politics of progress. Otherwise, we're simply engaging in a fantasy of utopias among ourselves, but ignoring 6 billion people in the rest of the world. And so I want you kindly to address maybe a few seconds, because of course this is an ultimate question that has been going on for millennia, but I think it's appropriate in this moment since the genie is out of the bottle.
Well, there are so many directions that we could have gone with this conversation tonight, and maybe there'll be another opportunity to do so. Just your question reminds me of a comment that was made by a man named Celestis Juma, who's at Harvard and thinks about these issues, and how unthinkingly a toaster was introduced into an indigenous community in Africa without any understanding of all of the complete reorganizations of that culture that a toaster required, from something as simple to bread that came in a loaf that was square-shaped that would fit into the slot to things like electricity. And I think that, again, I would commend to you Shiv's essay. There's other essays in this book that deal with the same subject. Our notion of progress is a particularly Western one. Not everybody shares a view of the value of progress by any means, that some believe that technology is value neutral, that it's just the ways that it's used that are of concern. Others would argue that technology in and of itself can have a does have terribly destructive influence. We talked a little bit about issues in patenting. We didn't get into the patenting issues as it applies to indigenous knowledge, as it implies to indigenous plants around the world. I mean, so I think that your question and your point is an incredibly important one, and it is something I wish we'd had time to talk about, and that of course needs to be the subject of a much farther-ranging conversation, and no conversation about science and technology and the issues that we're dealing with can be had without one, understanding the frame of reference from which one approaches the issues, and two, understanding them in a global context. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Michael, for making this possible, and thank you, Ray, again, for staying up late and participating, and of course, all of you. Thanks.